Love doesn't survive betrayal.
They say you never really know someone until you catch them without clothes in your own bed, with their boss's baby growing in their belly. I wish I could say that was the worst part of my Tuesday, but that would be a lie. My name is Tom Crane, and 3 days ago, I thought I was living the American dream in this postcard-perfect Maine town. Two-story farmhouse with good bones, a construction business that actually paid the bills, and a wife who looked like she stepped out of a corporate magazine. Melanie had that sharp-edged beauty that made other men stare and made me feel like I'd won some cosmic lottery. Turns out the house of cards was already falling. I was just too stupid to hear the wind. It started at Jenny Morrison's backyard barbecue last Saturday. Jenny's our neighbor, the kind of woman who knows everyone's business before they do and treats gossip like a competitive sport. I was nursing a beer by her fence, watching Melanie work the crowd in her designer sundress, when I overheard her talking to her best friend, Sasha. "So, when are you telling Tom about the little surprise?" Sasha asked, her voice carrying that particular brand of malicious glee that makes your skin crawl. Melanie laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Why ruin a good thing? Cal says we should wait until after the promotion goes through." Cal Dunstan, her boss at the corporate headquarters downtown, 6'2", of silver-haired charm and enough money to buy half this town. The kind of man who wore $1,000 suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. "Besides," Melanie continued, "Tom's so buried in his little construction projects, he barely notices I exist anymore. This baby deserves better than sawdust and broken dreams." The beer bottle slipped from my hand, shattering on Jenny's concrete patio. Everyone turned to stare, but I was already walking away, my world tilting sideways like a house built on a bad foundation. That night, I went through our shared calendar on my phone. There it was. Melanie had an appointment with Dr. Sarah Williams next Tuesday, OBGYN appointment. She'd listed it as routine checkup, but nothing about Melanie's secretive behavior lately had been routine. I started paying attention, really paying attention. Tuesday morning came like a freight train I couldn't dodge. I followed Melanie's silver BMW from our house on Griggs Mill Road to the medical complex downtown, sat in my pickup truck and watched her walk into the women's health clinic with the kind of confident stride that said she owned the world. When she came out an hour later, she was on her phone, smiling wider than I'd seen her smile in months. "Cal, it's confirmed. 12 weeks along." Her voice carried across the parking lot like a death sentence. I know, Tom doesn't suspect a thing." I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. 12 weeks. That put conception right around Valentine's Day. When I'd been in Portland for 3 days finishing a commercial renovation, and Melanie had claimed she was too sick with the flu to come along. The puzzle pieces fell together with sickening clarity. The expensive jewelry that appeared without explanation, the late nights at client dinners, the way she'd started looking at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. I pulled into our driveway and sat there for 10 minutes, staring at the house I'd been renovating for 2 years. The wraparound porch was still half finished, lumber stacked beside the front steps like good intentions gone wrong. The whole place looked tired, like it was giving up on being beautiful. That's when I made my first mistake. I decided to confront her directly. Melanie came home around 6, carrying takeout from the expensive Thai place on Main Street. She had that post-work glow that used to make my chest tighten with pride. Now it just made me sick. "We need to talk," I said, blocking her path to the kitchen. She set down the bag of food and turned to face me, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to something colder. "About what?" "About Cal Dunstan. About the baby you're carrying that isn't mine." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Then Melanie smiled, not the warm smile I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, but something sharp and calculating. "Took you long enough to figure it out," she said, brushing past me toward the stairs. "I was wondering when you'd grow a brain." "That's it? That's all you have to say?" She paused on the third step, her hand resting on the banister like she was posing for a magazine cover. "What do you want me to say, Tom? That I'm sorry? That it didn't mean anything?" She laughed, the sound echoing in our half-renovated living room. "It means everything. Cal can give me things you never could. Security, status, a future that doesn't involve wondering if we'll make rent next month. We own this house outright. My business is solid. Your business is small-time contractor work in a dying mill town." She cut me off. "Cal's offering me vice president at the regional office. Real money, real opportunities. And his baby." Her hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. A baby with a trust fund and private school tuition, already set aside. Not bad for 3 months of work. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Get out. Excuse me? Pack your crap and get out of my house tonight. Melanie's composure cracked just slightly. Don't be dramatic, Tom. We can work this out. I'll keep the baby. You'll keep the house. Everyone wins. Everyone wins. The words came out as a roar that surprised us both. You cheated on me, got pregnant by another man, and now you want to work it out? It's not like we had anything real anyway, she said, her voice turning icy again. When was the last time you looked at me? Really looked at me? I'm 34 years old, Tom. I'm not going to waste what's left of my good years playing house with someone who treats me like furniture. I stormed upstairs and yanked her suitcases out of the bedroom closet, throwing them onto our bed. Pack! Now! You can't kick me out. I live here too. Watch me. For the next hour, I stood in the doorway while she packed her designer clothes and expensive shoes. She moved with deliberate slowness, like she was trying to drag out every second, waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. When she was done, I carried her suitcases downstairs and threw them out the front door. They landed with satisfying thuds on the gravel driveway, spilling silk blouses and lacy underwear across the ground. You're making a mistake, Melanie said from the doorway. No, I replied, slamming the door in her face. I'm fixing one. I watched through the living room window as she gathered her scattered belongings, her face tight with humiliation. Jenny Morrison was working in her garden next door, pretending not to watch while taking in every detail. By tomorrow morning, the whole town would know that Tom Crane had thrown his wife out like yesterday's garbage. Good. Let them talk. I cracked open a beer and sat on my half-finished porch, watching Melanie load her car. She kept looking back at the house like she expected me to come running after her, begging for forgiveness. Instead, I raised my beer bottle in a mock toast and took a long drink. She drove away without another word, her taillights disappearing into the Maine evening like dying stars. I should have known it wouldn't be that easy. Around midnight, headlights swept across my front yard. Not Melanie's BMW, something bigger, darker. I looked through the window and felt a chill surge through me like ice water. A black Escalade sat in my driveway, engine running. 3 men climbed out, moving with the kind of casual confidence that said they were used to getting their way through intimidation. The biggest one I recognized, Grant Morrison, no relation to my neighbor Jenny. 6'4" of ex-military muscle, who worked as Cal Dunstan's head of security. I'd seen him around town, always wearing expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the tool-shaped bulge under his left armpit. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the front door and stepped outside. Private property, gentlemen. Time to leave. Grant smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too perfect. Easy there, contractor boy. We just want to have a conversation. Nothing to talk about. Boss says otherwise. Grant nodded to his companions, 2 younger men who looked like they'd learned their people skills in federal prison. Says you've been harassing his girl. That's not very neighborly. His girl was my wife until about 6 hours ago. Funny how things change. Grant stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something darker. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to apologize to Mrs. Crane for your little tantrum tonight. You're going to take her back, nice and quiet, and you're going to pretend that baby is yours when it comes. Or what? Or we're going to have to get creative about teaching you some manners. I tightened my grip on the bat. 3 against 1 doesn't seem very fair. Grant laughed, the sound echoing off the trees that surrounded my property. Fair's got nothing to do with it, Tom. This is about understanding your place in the world. And what place is that? Under my boss's boot heel. That's when I swung the bat. I caught Grant in the ribs, doubling him over with a grunt of pain. For a split second, I thought I might actually have a chance. Then his friends introduced me to the business end of a telescoping baton, and the world exploded into stars and darkness. When consciousness crawled back, I was bouncing around in the trunk of a car, my wrists zip-tied behind my back and my mouth tasting like copper pennies. Every pothole felt like a sledgehammer to my skull, and the stench of motor oil made my empty stomach clench with nausea. The car finally stopped, and the trunk opened to reveal Grant's ugly face, silhouetted against a canopy of pine trees. We were deep in the woods, the kind of deep where you could scream for hours without anyone hearing. Rise and shine, Sleeping Beauty, Grant said, hauling me out of the trunk by my shirt collar. Time for your education. They'd stripped me down to my boxers and work boots, leaving me shivering in the October night air. My ribs felt like broken glass, and something warm was trickling down the side of my head. "Here's the lesson," Grant continued, producing a hunting knife that gleamed in the moonlight. "You don't touch what belongs to Cal Dunstan. You don't threaten what belongs to Cal Dunstan. And you sure as heck don't embarrass what belongs to Cal Dunstan." "She's not property," I managed to croak through split lips. "Everything's property if you have enough money to buy it." He pressed the knife against my throat, just hard enough to leave a thin, stinging line, including you. "So what's the plan? End me and bury me out here?" Grant's smile widened. "Nothing that dramatic. Boss wants you alive, but humbled. Wants you to understand that crossing him has consequences." He nodded to his companions, who grabbed my arms and forced me to my knees in the pine needles and dead leaves. "This is what happens when small-town boys forget their place," Grant said, drawing back his fist. What happened next was a 20-minute master class in professional intimidation. They didn't break any bones or do any permanent damage. These were experts who knew exactly how much punishment a body could take without shutting down completely. When they were done, I looked like I'd been hit by a logging truck, but I was still breathing. "Tell anyone about this little conversation," Grant said as they dragged me deeper into the woods. "And next time won't be so friendly." They left me tied to a tree about 5 miles from the nearest road, still in my boxers, scraped and battered from a dozen different cuts and bruises. The zip ties were tight enough to cut off circulation, and the October night was cold enough to end. "Someone will find you eventually," Grant called over his shoulder as they walked away, "or they won't. Either way, you've learned your lesson." Their footsteps faded into the darkness, leaving me alone with the sound of wind through the trees and the distant howl of coyotes. I spent the next 3 hours working my wrists raw against the rough bark of the pine tree, using anger as fuel to keep hypothermia at bay. The zip ties finally snapped around 4 in the morning, just as the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the canopy. It took me another 2 hours to stumble through the woods to the old logging road that led back to civilization. By the time I reached pavement, I looked like something that had crawled out of a horror movie, clothes torn and limping like a wounded animal. Old Pete Hoffman found me collapsed beside Route 15, delirious from exhaustion and losing too much fluid. Pete was a retired cop who lived in a cabin about 10 miles from town, the kind of crusty old fool who minded his own business and expected everyone else to do the same. "Jesus Christ, Tom," he muttered, loading me into his ancient Ford pickup. "What the heck happened to you?" "Cal Dunstan happened to me." Pete's weathered face darkened with understanding. Everyone in town knew Cal's reputation, even if most people were too smart or too scared to talk about it openly. "We need to get you to a hospital." "No hospitals, no cops. Just get me somewhere safe where I can think." Pete studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "My place it is." He spent the next day cleaning my wounds and feeding me soup while I told him the whole story. Pete listened without judgment, occasionally grunting or shaking his gray head. "So what's your play?" he asked when I was done. "I don't know yet." "Well, you better figure it out quick. Men like Cal don't issue warnings twice. Next time they come for you, it'll be permanent." That night, lying on Pete's lumpy couch with my ribs wrapped in medical tape, I stared at the ceiling and let my anger crystallize into something harder and more focused. Cal Dunstan thought he'd broken me, thought he'd taught me my place in the natural order of things. He was wrong. I spent the next week at Pete's cabin, healing and planning. Pete had contacts throughout the county, retired cops, construction workers, bartenders, and mechanics who formed the invisible network that kept small towns running. Within 3 days, I knew more about Cal Dunstan's business dealings than his own accountant. The man was dirty, but he was smart about it. Nothing obviously illegal, just the kind of creative accounting and selective bid processes that made millionaires out of men with flexible morals. He owned half the commercial real estate in town, had his fingers in 3 different construction companies, and maintained a stable of local politicians who jumped when he whistled. But every man has weaknesses, and Cal's was his ego. He liked people to know he was untouchable, liked the fear and respect that came with his reputation. Most importantly, he liked to be seen as the kind of man who took what he wanted and suffered no consequences. That pride was going to be his downfall. My first target was Grant Morrison. I spent 2 days watching his routine, learning his habits. Every Tuesday night, Grant went to Mickey's Bar on Main Street to drink expensive whiskey and intimidate the locals. He always parked his pristine black Mercedes in the alley behind the building, away from the foot traffic and potential vandals. Tuesday night, I was waiting for him. Grant stumbled out of Mickey's around midnight, drunk enough to be careless, but not drunk enough to be helpless. Perfect. I caught him halfway to his car, stepping out of the shadows like something from his worst nightmares. "Remember me?" I asked, holding up the aluminum baseball bat I'd borrowed from Pete's garage. Grant's hand moved instinctively toward his shoulder holster, but he was too slow and too drunk. I cracked him across the knuckles with the bat, sending his pistol skittering across the wet pavement. "Easy there, tough guy," I said, kicking the tool into a storm drain. "We're just going to have a conversation. You're a dead man, Crane. Maybe. But first, you're going to learn some manners." What followed wasn't pretty, but it was effective. I didn't break any bones or cause any permanent damage. I'd learned from the best, after all. But I made sure Grant would remember every second of our little chat. When I was done, I zip-tied his hands behind his back and used duct tape to secure him to the driver's seat of his Mercedes. Then I opened every window, cranked up the heat to maximum, and dumped a bucket of raw shrimp I'd bought from the fish market under the dashboard. "By the time someone finds you," I told him, "this car is going to smell like low tide in heck. Enjoy explaining that to your boss." I took pictures of Grant's humiliation with his own phone, then posted them to every social media account he had. Within hours, the images were circulating through town like wildfire. The big, scary enforcer reduced to a zip-tied, shrimp-scented laughingstock. The next morning, I drove to Cal's office building downtown. I didn't go inside. I just sat in the parking lot waiting for him to see me. He came out around 10, flanked by 2 new security guards who looked even meaner than Grant. Cal's silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit worth more than most people made in a month. He looked like success incarnate, right up until his eyes met mine. I rolled down my window and smiled, giving him a friendly wave. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Cal?" I called out. His face went white with rage. He said something to his security team, but they were smart enough to recognize a public place with witnesses. Instead of charging across the parking lot, they climbed into Cal's Bentley and drove away. But the message was delivered. I wasn't hiding anymore. That afternoon, Melanie showed up at Pete's cabin. "Tom, we need to talk," she said, standing on the porch in a designer maternity dress that showed off her growing bump. "Nothing to talk about," I replied, not bothering to get up from my chair. "You can't keep doing this. Cal's lawyers can kiss my A." Melanie's composure cracked slightly. "You're going to get yourself ended." "Maybe, but first, I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of woman you are. What's that supposed to mean?" I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot of the town's private Facebook group, the digital gossip mill where information traveled faster than wildfire. Someone had posted a photo of Melanie and Cal kissing in the parking lot of the Riverside Motel, along with a detailed timeline of their affair. "Jenny Morrison's been busy," I said, watching the color drain from Melanie's face. "Turns out she's been tracking your little love nest visits for months. Amazing what people notice when they're paying attention. You fool. I learned from the best." Melanie looked like she wanted to say something else, but her phone started buzzing with notifications. Her face went ashen as she scrolled through the comments and messages. "This won't work," she said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "Cal won't let you destroy him. Cal's going to be too busy trying to save his own reputation to worry about mine." She left without another word, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The untouchable corporate wife was starting to realize that some things couldn't be bought or bullied into submission. That night, someone threw a brick through Pete's front window. The message tied to it was short and to the point. "Back off or else." "Subtle?" Pete muttered, sweeping up broken glass. "Real subtle. They're getting desperate. Desperate men do stupid things. You sure you want to keep poking this bear?" I thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Heck yes. The next phase of my campaign required more finesse than brute force. Cal Dunstan had built his empire on reputation and intimidation, which meant his real weakness was public embarrassment. I started small. Anonymous tips to the local newspaper about Cal's business practices. Carefully worded questions at town council meetings about no-bid contracts and campaign contributions. Nothing actionable, nothing illegal, just enough to plant seeds of doubt in people's minds. Within 2 weeks, the Whisper campaign was gaining momentum. People who'd been afraid to question Cal's method suddenly found their voices. Business owners who'd been muscled into unfavorable deals began sharing their stories. The real breakthrough came when I approached Danny Sullivan, a local journalist who'd been trying to investigate Cal's operations for years, but never had enough evidence to publish anything. "I can give you everything you need," I told him over coffee at a diner outside of town. "But it has to be done right. No cowboy journalism, no unsubstantiated claims, just facts." Danny's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "What's your angle here, Tom? What do you get out of this?" "Justice." "That's it?" I thought about Melanie's cruel laughter, Grant's fists, and the taste of pine needles and metal in my mouth. "That's enough." Over the next month, Danny and I worked together to build an airtight case against Cal's business empire. Bank records, witness statements, documented payoffs. We assembled a paper trail that read like a masterclass in small-town corruption. The story broke on a Thursday morning, splashed across the front page of the county newspaper with the headline, "Money, Power, and Corruption. The Cal Dunstan Empire Exposed." By noon, every news outlet in Maine was picking up the story. By evening, it had gone statewide. Cal's carefully constructed world began crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. The state attorney general announced an investigation. The FBI opened a file. Local prosecutors started subpoenaing records. Within a week, 3 of Cal's biggest government contracts were suspended pending review. But the real damage was social. In a small town like ours, reputation was everything, and Cal's had been shattered beyond repair. The man who'd once commanded fear and respect was now a laughingstock, the corrupt businessman who'd been brought down by a small-town contractor with a grudge. Melanie tried to distance herself from the scandal, but it was too late. The affair was public knowledge now, and her pregnancy had become the town's favorite source of gossip and speculation. She'd moved in with Sasha, but even her best friend was starting to look at her like a liability. I was having dinner at Mickey's bar one Friday night when I overheard Jenny Morrison talking to a group of women at the next table. "Can you believe the nerve of that woman?" Jenny was saying, her voice carrying across the crowded restaurant. "Parading around town with another man's baby like she's some kind of victim." "I heard Cal hasn't returned her calls in 2 weeks," another woman added. "Soon as the heat got turned up, he dropped her like a hot potato." "What did she expect?" Jenny replied. "Men like that don't leave their wives for their side pieces. They just use them up and throw them away." The conversation continued, each woman adding her own layer of judgment and speculation. By the time they were done, Melanie's reputation was as dead as Cal's business empire. I should have felt satisfied. The people who'd tried to destroy me were getting their comeuppance, and justice was being served with a hefty helping of public humiliation. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The final confrontation came on a cold November evening at the old Griggs Mill, the abandoned textile factory that had given our road its name. The building had been empty for 20 years, a crumbling monument to the town's industrial past. I'd chosen the location carefully. It was isolated enough for privacy, but public enough that whatever happened there would eventually be discovered and talked about. Most importantly, it had the kind of symbolic weight that would make the whole thing feel like destiny instead of coincidence. Cal showed up alone, which surprised me. I'd expected him to bring his remaining security team or at least a few lawyers. Instead, he climbed out of his battered Toyota. His Bentley had been repossessed the week before, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 2 months. "You wanted to meet," he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "Here I am. Funny how things change," I replied, stepping out of the shadows where I'd been waiting. 2 months ago, you had me beaten and dumped in the woods like garbage. Now you're driving a 15-year-old sedan and living in a 1-bedroom apartment above the hardware store." Cal's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. The investigations had frozen his assets, and his wife had filed for divorce, taking half of what remained. The mighty had fallen hard and fast. "What do you want?" he asked. An apology would be a good start. For what? For thinking you owned this town, for thinking you owned my wife, for thinking you could destroy me and walk away clean. Cal laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you've won something here? You think destroying me makes you the hero of this story? I think it makes us even?" "Even?" His voice rose with genuine anger. "You've cost me everything. My business, my reputation, my marriage." "Your marriage?" I stepped closer, close enough to see the fear in his eyes. "You mean the wife you were cheating on with mine? That marriage? At least I didn't put my dirty laundry on display for the whole town to see. No, you just tried to have me beaten to death for catching you." We stared at each other across 10 feet of broken concrete and accumulated debris. Two men who'd lost everything for different reasons. "So what now?" Cal asked. "You going to finish the job, beat me to death in this old ruin, and claim self-defense?" "Nothing that dramatic," I said, pulling out my phone. "I just want to make sure the whole world knows who the real Cal Dunstan is." I hit the Facebook Live button and turned the camera toward him. Within seconds, people were joining the stream. Curious townspeople who'd been following the scandal like a soap opera. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "I'd like you to meet Cal Dunstan, the man who thought he was untouchable, the man who destroyed families for fun and profit, the man who's about to learn what accountability looks like." Cal's face went white as he realized what was happening. "Turn that off." "Or what? You'll have your boys rough me up again? Oh wait, Grant Morrison's working security at the mall now, making $12 an hour. Funny how loyalty only flows one way when the money runs out." "You son of a witch." "My mother was a saint compared to you," I replied, keeping the camera focused on his face. "Now, about that apology." What happened next was 18 minutes of the most satisfying television I'd ever been part of. Cal tried to leave twice, but I blocked his path, keeping him in frame while hundreds of people watched online. The comments were brutal and immediate. Former employees sharing their own stories of mistreatment, business owners detailing his corrupt practices, and ordinary citizens expressing their disgust at his arrogance. By the time it was over, Cal was sobbing like a child, his carefully constructed facade completely shattered. The powerful businessman had been reduced to what he'd always been underneath, a weak, greedy man who'd mistaken fear for respect. "Are we done here?" he asked, when the camera finally stopped recording. "Almost," I said, walking to my truck and returning with a manila envelope. "One last thing." I handed him the envelope, which contained copies of every document Danny Sullivan and I had gathered during our investigation. Bank records, witness statements, recorded phone calls, everything that had brought down his empire. "This is your life's work," I told him. "Take a good look at what corruption and arrogance bought you." Cal opened the envelope with shaking hands, his face growing paler with each page. When he was done, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You're thorough, I'll give you that. I learned from the best. You taught me that documentation is everything." He stood there for a long moment holding the evidence of his own destruction. Then he laughed, a bitter, broken sound that echoed off the abandoned factory walls. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. "I actually respected you. Right up until the end, I thought you were just another small-town loser who didn't know his place, but you're actually dangerous. Only to people who deserve it." Cal nodded, accepting the judgment. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the beating. Grant went too far with that." "Grant was following orders." "Yeah, he was." Cal looked around the ruined factory, taking in the broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. "Seems fitting, doesn't it? Two men who've lost everything, meeting in a place that's already dead?" "I haven't lost everything," I corrected him. "I've got my self-respect back. And I've got nothing left to lose." He turned toward his car, then paused. "Watch yourself, Tom. Men like me don't stay down forever. We're like cockroaches. We survive everything and come back stronger. Men like you are exactly why the world needs men like me." He drove away without another word, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness. I sat on the hood of my truck and watched the sun set behind the trees, feeling something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The Facebook Live video went viral within hours, racking up thousands of views and hundreds of shares. People from across the state were commenting, sharing their own stories about corrupt officials and crooked businessmen. Cal Dunstan had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system, and his public humiliation had given others the courage to speak truth to power. But my real victory wasn't the viral video or the newspaper headlines. It was simpler and more personal than that. 3 days later, I was back at my house on Griggs Mill Road, working on the front porch that had been sitting half-finished for 2 years. The physical work felt good after months of scheming and plotting. Clean, honest labor that produced tangible results. That's when Melanie and Sasha showed up. They climbed out of Sasha's car looking like refugees from a disaster zone. Melanie's designer clothes had been replaced by discount store maternity wear, and her perfectly styled hair hung limp and unwashed. Sasha looked even worse, dark circles under her eyes and the hunted expression of someone who discovered that loyalty was a luxury she couldn't afford. "We need to talk," Melanie said, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. About what? I asked, not bothering to look up from the board I was nailing into place. About ending this. About calling a truce. I set down my hammer and turned to face them. A truce? What makes you think we're at war? Don't play dumb, Tom. You've systematically destroyed everything Cal built. You've made me a pariah in my own hometown. I've held people accountable for their actions, I interrupted. That's not the same thing as warfare. Sasha stepped forward, her face twisted with desperation. You don't understand what you've done. Cal's finished, but he's taking the rest of us down with him. I'm losing my house. Mel can't find work anywhere in the county. You're both learning what consequences feel like, I said. Welcome to the real world. This isn't justice, Melanie said, her voice breaking. This is revenge. Sometimes they're the same thing. She started to cry then, not the manipulative tears she'd used to get her way for years, but genuine sobs of a woman who'd finally run out of options. Under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for her. I'm pregnant, Tom. Whatever you think of me, this baby doesn't deserve to suffer for its parents' mistakes. You're right, I said, surprising them both. That baby deserves better than a mother who thinks adultery is a career move and a father who orders beatings like room service. Then help us, Sasha pleaded. You've made your point. Everyone knows what we did. Isn't that enough? I considered the question for a long moment, looking at these two women who'd once seemed so untouchable, so confident in their power to manipulate and destroy. Now they were broken, desperate, reduced to begging for mercy from the man they'd tried to crush. No, I said finally. It's not enough. What more do you want? Melanie asked. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to live with the choices you made. I want you to remember every single day for the rest of your lives that you brought this on yourselves. That's cruel. So is cheating on your husband with your boss. So is getting pregnant and expecting him to raise another man's child. So is having him beaten and dumped in the woods when he objects. Melanie's face hardened with something approaching her old arrogance. You think you're so righteous, don't you? The wounded husband getting his noble revenge. I think I'm a man who was pushed too far and decided to push back. And what about forgiveness? What about moving on with your life? I'll move on when I'm ready. Right now, I'm exactly where I want to be. They left after that, climbing back into Sasha's car with the defeated posture of people who'd finally accepted their fate. I watched them drive away, feeling no satisfaction in their misery, but no regret either. That night, I sat on my completed porch with a beer and looked out at the small town that had shaped me, broken me, and ultimately forged me.